My golden boy brother and his fiancée demanded my inheritance for their wedding. When my parents took their side, I exposed a dark family secret. I always knew I'd live in my brother's shadow. My parents called him their golden boy, and they weren't shy about it. Every birthday, every school achievement, every minor success, it was him first, me later, if at all. I learned early that recognition in my family came in the form of praise for GBB, my golden boy brother, while my own victories were barely acknowledged. Growing up, I tried everything to win their approval. Straight A's, community awards, even small thoughtful gestures that I hoped would show I cared. But nothing worked. The moment my achievements began to rival his, they'd brush me off with a, well, that's nice, but you should see what your brother did, or a subtle sigh that cut deeper than any criticism ever could. Yet, despite all of this, I stayed quiet. I didn't complain because complaining would only make me the jealous one. My brother, meanwhile, thrived. Charismatic, charming, effortlessly persuasive. He was everything I wasn't, and my parents made sure the world knew it. Then came the wedding announcement. It wasn't the engagement itself that shocked me. It was the demand. GBB's fiancée, a woman I barely knew but had already sized me up as the obstacle, sent a carefully worded message to my parents. She said that for their dream wedding, they needed my inheritance. All of it. She phrased it delicately, like she was doing me a favor by giving me the opportunity to support the family celebration. I remember reading the email while my hands shook. This has to be a joke, I muttered, but my parents didn't laugh, not even a little. You know, my mother said, smiling like she was trying to calm me, it's only fair. Your brother worked so hard and he's starting his life. He deserves our support. I froze. Support? They weren't asking for a loan. They were demanding my birthright. The savings, the investments, the small inheritance left by my grandfather, everything I had been promised for years was suddenly negotiable. And in my parents' eyes, it wasn't even a discussion. Mom, Dad, I don't think this is right, I said, my voice trembling, despite my best effort to stay calm. Oh, come now, my father said, leaning back in his chair. Your brother has plans. He's your elder sibling. He deserves a head start. Don't make this a big deal. I remember biting my tongue to keep from yelling. I wanted to scream, to throw the papers across the room, to make them see the injustice staring them in the face, but instead I swallowed my frustration and nodded silently. I had to, for now. That night, I sat in my room, staring at the stack of documents that represented my inheritance, my future, and my hard work, and all I could think was, how did it come to this? How did my family become this twisted? I thought back to childhood memories I'd buried, little moments that didn't make sense until now. My brother always got the bigger slice of cake, the better present, the attention of relatives, the praise, even when he misbehaved. And yet, whenever I confronted my parents about it, they'd smile and say, he's special, you'll understand when you're older. Well, I was older now, and I understood more than I ever wanted to. The next morning, GBB strutted into the living room with a smug grin, holding a wedding magazine. Did you see the venue we booked? He asked as if I were supposed to care. It's perfect. And Mom says we're all set with the budget. Thanks to you, of course. I felt my stomach drop. Thanks to me? Oh, come on, he said, waving a hand. Don't act like you're not helping. Family helps each other out, right? I forced a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. I could see the fiancé standing in the background, smiling at me with that fake, sweet expression that barely hid her satisfaction. They were enjoying this, both of them. And my parents? Silent. Their eyes darted away when I looked at them. They had made their choice. I retreated to my room that day, heart pounding, mind spinning. I couldn't accept this. I couldn't. But I also knew I needed to be smart. Exploding in anger wouldn't help me. I needed leverage. I needed information. I needed a plan. As I sat at my desk going through old documents, I noticed something odd. An envelope tucked behind a pile of papers. It wasn't recent. It was old, yellowed with age, but it bore my grandfather's seal. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were letters, financial records, and notes that hinted at something far bigger than I'd ever imagined. The family I thought I knew was hiding secrets. Big ones, dangerous ones, ones that could change everything. I didn't know it yet, but finding that envelope was the first step. The first step toward exposing the truth, taking control, and showing my brother, his fiancée, and even my parents exactly what happens when you underestimate someone you've spent your whole life trying to keep down. That night, I made a silent promise. I wouldn't just fight back. I wouldn't just protect my inheritance. I would uncover every secret, every lie, and every betrayal my family had buried over the years. And I would use it to make sure they never tried to rob me again. Little did I know, the family I loved, or thought I loved, was about to split in half, and I was the one who would push the first domino. The days after the inheritance demand were a strange kind of hell. My brother and his fiancée seemed to float through life untouched by guilt or consequence, planning their extravagant wedding as if the universe itself existed to serve them. My parents, meanwhile, were cheerfully blind, throwing their support behind him with all the enthusiasm they had once reserved for me. I tried to act normal around them, to pretend I was okay with this, but it was impossible. Every casual mention of the wedding felt like a knife twisting in my gut. Even small things, like my mother's insistence that I help with the seating arrangements, or my father asking me to review the guest list, were reminders that I was being sidelined, my contributions acknowledged only as a tool for their perfect picture. I started spending nights poring over the envelope I had found, the one with my grandfather's letters and financial records. Each time I looked at it, I noticed things I had missed before, inconsistencies in account statements, coded references to properties I didn't even know existed, and hints that my inheritance might have been manipulated long before this moment. It wasn't just about money anymore. I had begun to see cracks in the perfect family facade, little lies hidden in plain sight, the way my father brushed off questions about the past, the way my mother hesitated when asked about family investments, the way my brother, smiling and charming as always, never had to answer for anything. Something wasn't right. I decided to dig deeper, quietly. I couldn't afford to be reckless, not yet. My first step was to talk to a distant relative I barely knew, Uncle Sam, who had once managed some of my grandfather's finances. On the pretense of wanting to discuss family history, I invited him over for coffee one Saturday morning. "Uncle Sam," I began casually, "I found some old letters from Grandpa. Some of them mentioned investments, properties, stuff I never knew existed. Did he ever talk to you about these?" Uncle Sam's eyes flickered for a moment, and I thought I saw recognition, or fear. Yes. "Your grandfather was careful about what he shared," he said slowly, as if weighing his words. "He had his reasons for keeping things private." "Private?" I asked, leaning forward. "You mean he hid things from the family?" "Well," he said cautiously, "not exactly hidden. Let's just say, not everyone in the family was ready to handle certain truths. That was all I needed." My pulse quickened. There was something buried. Over the next week, I started piecing together more fragments, old bank statements tucked into drawers, photographs of properties I'd never seen, letters written in a code my grandfather used when discussing finances. Each piece seemed harmless alone, but together they told a story I wasn't sure I was ready to believe. Meanwhile, my brother and his fiancée continued to flaunt their plans. The engagement party invitations arrived with gold embossing, and I had to smile through gritted teeth as my parents beamed with pride. Every conversation in the house was laced with their smug entitlement. Every joke, every glance, every shared laugh between them felt like an affront. And yet, I couldn't let anger cloud my judgment. I had to be smart. I had to gather proof before confronting anyone. Otherwise, I'd just be the angry sibling who shouted and lost. And that was exactly the narrative they expected. One evening, I returned to the envelope for the third time, scanning each document with a meticulous eye. That's when I noticed something buried beneath a stack of old letters. A folder labeled simply, "Family Trust Confidential." My heart raced as I opened it. Inside were detailed records of assets, hidden accounts, and instructions that suggested my grandfather had planned for someone, me, to inherit more than anyone suspected. But there was a catch. Buried in legal jargon and faded ink was a clause I hadn't anticipated. The inheritance could be contested if any family member could prove mismanagement or concealment. Suddenly, the situation wasn't just about my brother demanding money. It was about control, about power, about which version of the family story would dominate. And it was clear. If I wanted to protect my future, I had to uncover the full truth before anyone else could manipulate it. The first step was clear. I had to dig into the past, really dig in. Old family disputes, past financial decisions, and the stories my parents had always avoided discussing suddenly became my roadmap. Each revelation would bring me closer to understanding the real legacy of my grandfather. And the more I discovered, the more I realized that my brother's and fiancée's demand was only the tip of a very dark iceberg. I began my investigation like a detective in my own life. I spoke to former family lawyers under the guise of curiosity, contacted accountants who had worked with my grandfather decades ago, and even reached out to distant relatives who had quietly been sidelined by my parents. Each conversation added another layer, another piece of the puzzle. The deeper I dug, the more I saw a pattern. My parents weren't merely partial. They were protecting something that my brother and his fiancée didn't know yet. And if I played my cards right, I could turn that secret into leverage. But the tension in the house was building. My brother began asking pointed questions. "Why are you so obsessed with old papers? Are you planning something?" I only smiled. Just curious, I said, careful not to reveal the storm brewing in my mind. Curiosity, though, was only a cover. Behind it, I was planning. Every document, every conversation, every subtle inconsistency would be cataloged. And when the time came, I wouldn't just refuse to hand over my inheritance. I would expose the truth. And once that truth was revealed, nothing in my family would ever be the same. The investigation had consumed me for weeks. Every night, I stayed up late with stacks of papers, folders, and old photographs spread across my desk. My brother's wedding plans were in full swing, and every conversation in the house felt like a battle I wasn't allowed to fight openly. Still, I persisted. Then, one rainy evening, everything changed. Yet, I had contacted a lawyer who had worked with my grandfather decades ago. Posing as a curious relative, wanting to understand family history, I asked about unusual financial arrangements. After a long pause, the lawyer leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Your grandfather, he left instructions that were very precise. Not just about the inheritance, but about who should never gain control. I blinked. Never? Yes, he said with a somber tone. He anticipated the possibility that certain family members could be manipulative. He made provisions to protect against that. But these provisions were confidential. Only certain trusted individuals were aware of them, and many were lost when he passed away. My heart pounded. Could this be the leverage I needed? I pressed further. Do you know if anyone tried to bypass these instructions? The lawyer hesitated. There were rumors. Your parents, they may have tried, but they were careful. Your brother was not supposed to inherit directly from certain assets. And yet, he left the sentence unfinished, but I didn't need him to finish. My mind raced through the documents I'd already seen. Hidden trusts, coded letters, mentions of secret accounts. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces fit together. My brother and his fiancée weren't just greedy. They were blind to the rules my grandfather had set up to prevent them from taking everything. My parents, on the other hand, were willing to gamble on bending or hiding the truth. I returned home in a daze, barely noticing the rain soaking my jacket. Sitting in my room, I spread the documents across the desk once more. And then I found it. A folder I had overlooked before, buried beneath a pile of old letters. Its title was simple: Family Legacy Restricted Access. Inside were bank statements, property deeds, and letters written in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. But it wasn't just financial information. There were notes, cryptic but clear, warning about family members who were untrustworthy. And, most shockingly, a document explicitly stating that my inheritance could be secured only if it was proven that it would be mismanaged by others. I reread it, heart pounding. My brother and his fiancée had already demanded my inheritance. My parents had sided with them blindly. All of their assumptions about entitlement were based on what they wanted to see, not reality. And the biggest shock? The document mentioned something my family had never spoken about. A hidden business empire that my grandfather had built before anyone knew him. My parents had been managing some of it, but much of it had been hidden from them. And it was meant to come to me, completely. A mix of excitement and fear surged through me. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about justice, truth, and reclaiming what was rightfully mine. But I also realized how delicate this was. One wrong move, and my brother, his fiancée, or even my parents could try to bury the truth. I had to be meticulous. Over the next few days, I pieced together more details. I traced accounts, contacted former business associates, and even reached out to distant family friends who had been loyal to my grandfather. Each revelation confirmed what I suspected. My inheritance, my grandfather's true legacy, had been deliberately obscured, and the people closest to me, the ones I trusted, were the very ones who had allowed this to happen. My brother remained blissfully unaware. He spent hours choosing flowers, seating arrangements, and luxury cars for the wedding. His fiancée prattled on about catering, photographers, and dresses as if she owned the world. Meanwhile, I silently cataloged every lie, every manipulation, every attempt to marginalize me. I began to see a path forward. I could expose them, not in anger, but with precision. I could dismantle their assumptions, reveal the truth to my parents, and protect what was mine. And I could do it in a way that left them reeling, powerless, and forced to confront their own moral failures. But before I could act, I needed more proof, something undeniable. I needed evidence that even my parents couldn't ignore, something concrete that tied together their favoritism, their willingness to side with my brother, and the deliberate attempts to hide my inheritance. And then, a breakthrough. While reviewing old letters, I found one addressed to my grandfather from a family lawyer dated years before my brother's birth. The letter mentioned a contingency plan, a legal safeguard designed to prevent my brother and his fiancée from claiming more than they were entitled to. The document even referenced secret accounts that could only be accessed with proof of malfeasance by others. I leaned back in my chair, a grim smile spreading across my face. This was it. This was the key. I wasn't just fighting for money anymore. I was fighting for the truth, for justice, and for the chance to finally stand up to the people who had treated me as invisible for my entire life. The storm outside mirrored my thoughts. Rain pelted the windows and thunder rolled in the distance. I knew the coming days would be tense. Every conversation in the house, every casual remark from my brother or parents could be a trigger or an opportunity. I had to choose my moves carefully. One thing was certain. Once the secret was revealed, nothing in our family would ever be the same. My brother's smug confidence, his fiance's manipulations, and even my parents' blind favoritism. They all depended on ignorance. And ignorance, I had learned, could be shattered with the right proof. I sat back, taking a deep breath, and whispered to myself, "It's time to play chess with the people who thought they controlled the board. And this time, I'm 3 moves ahead." By the time I reached chapter 4 in my plan, figuratively, if not literally, I had realized that patience would be my greatest weapon. My brother and his fiancée were arrogant, blind to subtle cues, and utterly convinced of their invincibility. My parents, on the other hand, were comfortable in their willful ignorance. But arrogance and ignorance can be exploited, and I intended to do just that. I began by observing. Every movement, every conversation, every careless glance was a potential piece of evidence. I started keeping a meticulous log of interactions, dates, times, topics, even tones of voice. The more I watched, the more patterns emerged. My brother assumed he was untouchable. My parents assumed I was irrelevant. Both were wrong. The first step in my trap was subtle, small tests to gauge their reactions. I casually mentioned to my mother that I had found a discrepancy in one of the old account statements. Her reaction was telling. A flicker of irritation crossed her face, quickly replaced by practiced neutrality. My father, however, could barely hide his anxiety, brushing it off with a tight smile. The next test involved my brother's fiancée. I let slip a vague comment about a secret investment account Grandpa set up that no one should touch. Her eyes narrowed slightly, a shadow of concern flickering across her perfectly made-up face. She asked me with feigned curiosity, "Really? Where did you hear that?" "Just some letters I found," I replied, keeping my tone light, casual. "Nothing important, unless someone tries to mess with them." I could feel the shift. They were already beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as powerless as they had assumed. Meanwhile, I arranged discreet meetings with old family associates. I met former accountants, distant relatives, and even a retired lawyer who had been present when my grandfather drafted his final instructions. Each person I spoke with added a piece of the puzzle, confirming the deliberate measures my grandfather had put in place to protect my inheritance from manipulation. And then came the decisive move, a recording device. I set up a small, discreet recorder in the study, knowing that my brother and his fiancée would inevitably talk about finances while my parents were distracted. Within days, I captured conversations that would make anyone's jaw drop. My brother openly discussed ways to circumvent the inheritance rules, assuming he was speaking in private. His fiancée chimed in with her own manipulations, suggesting creative ways to pressure my parents. And my parents? They didn't intervene. They nodded, entertained by the scheming, blind to the implications of their complicity. Listening to the recordings, I felt a mix of anger and grim satisfaction. They had all underestimated me. They assumed I would comply, that I would stay silent, that I would let them rewrite my grandfather's legacy for their own gain. They were wrong, but I couldn't act hastily. The next phase required precision. I drafted a careful outline of how the exposure would unfold. Step 1, confront the fiancé with the evidence subtly, planting seeds of doubt in her mind about whether my brother could ever secure the inheritance. Step 2, allow my parents to hear certain carefully chosen excerpts from the recordings, timed to maximize their discomfort without revealing everything. Step 3, finally, expose the full truth to the entire family, leaving no room for denial. To prepare, I created copies of all key documents, organized every piece of evidence, and memorized the timeline of events meticulously. Every conversation, every interaction, every suspicious glance I had noted would serve as corroboration when the time came. And then, almost as if sensing the tension in the house, my brother began acting differently. He was jittery, a touch too eager in his displays of confidence. He asked me pointed questions, probing for weaknesses, but I stayed calm, maintaining the persona of someone distracted by personal projects. The fiancée, however, started showing cracks. She asked subtle questions about the family trust, the accounts, the letters, trying to catch me off guard. I responded carefully, leaving just enough ambiguity to keep her uneasy. Her confidence was waning, and she didn't even realize it yet. One evening, as the sun set and cast long shadows across the living room, I overheard a conversation that would confirm my suspicions. My brother whispered to his fiancée, "I think they know something. That look in their eyes, it's different." I smiled quietly to myself. Yes, they were beginning to understand, but they didn't know the half of it. I continued to set subtle traps, allowing them to reveal more than they intended. Every boast, every manipulation, every casual dismissal became ammunition. Every interaction was carefully recorded and cataloged. The house, once a place of frustration and helplessness, had become my chessboard. Every move they made was another piece I could use to tip the balance in my favor. By the end of chapter 4, in my mental plan, I knew this. My brother and his fiancée were walking into a storm of their own making. My parents, caught between loyalty and truth, would be forced to confront reality. And I, once powerless, had turned the tables completely. The trap was set. All that remained was to pull the first string, and when I did, nothing would ever be the same. The day I had been preparing for finally arrived. Weeks of meticulous planning, observation, and investigation had led to this moment. The evidence was solid, the recordings were clear, and the documents irrefutable. I wasn't angry anymore. I was precise, deliberate, and ready to show my family the truth they had spent decades ignoring. I invited everyone to the living room under the pretense of a casual family meeting. My brother, sensing nothing, was lounging with his fiancée beside him, speaking in hushed tones about the wedding guest list. My parents sat across from them, smiling, unaware that the atmosphere was about to change. "Thanks for coming," I said, keeping my tone calm and even. "I want to talk about the family finances, the inheritance, and some things I've discovered in the process." The room went quiet. My parents exchanged a brief glance. My brother raised an eyebrow. The fiancé leaned forward, interest piqued but suspicion absent. I placed the first folder on the table. I found documents, letters, and accounts that proved my grandfather's intentions were very clear. He didn't just leave an inheritance, he left instructions about how it should be managed, who it should go to, and what would happen if anyone tried to manipulate it. My brother snorted. "What are you talking about? You mean the money we all grew up hearing about?" "Yes," I replied, voice steady. "Exactly that money. But it's more complicated than you think. Grandpa anticipated attempts to take more than what was fair, and those attempts, they've already been made." I picked up a recording device. I have proof. Conversations between my brother, his fiancée, and even my parents themselves, showing their attempts to sideline me, manipulate the trust, and demand funds that were never theirs to claim. The fiancé's eyes widened. My brother froze, realizing for the first time that I wasn't bluffing. My parents looked horrified, but it was too late to back down. I pressed play. The device captured every word. My brother and his fiancée openly discussing strategies to claim the inheritance. The fiancé instructing him on pressure tactics. My parents laughing and encouraging them. The sound of their own voices accusing me in advance, betraying their complicity. It was devastating. When it ended, the room was silent. My parents' faces were pale. My brother's jaw was tight. The fiancé's hands trembled as she clutched her purse. "This isn't about me being vindictive," I said calmly. "This is about fairness, about honoring my grandfather's intentions, and about holding the people who tried to manipulate those intentions accountable." My father opened his mouth, but no words came. My mother's lips quivered, and finally she whispered, We didn't realize. You didn't realize because you wanted to believe your golden boy could do no wrong," I said softly, cutting through the tension. "You chose loyalty over truth, and now you're faced with reality." I laid out the documents showing the hidden accounts, the letters specifying contingencies, and the clear instructions for the inheritance. I detailed every discrepancy my family had ignored or attempted to conceal. Every manipulation, every lie, every favoritism that had fueled this conflict was now undeniable. My brother finally spoke, his voice strained. "You can't do this. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I interrupted. "I understand that you assumed your charm and entitlement could bypass rules set in place to prevent this exact scenario. I understand that you thought I'd be powerless, and I understand that your fiancé is just as manipulative as you are." Her face twisted into anger. "You can't just..." "Oh, I can," I said, "because I have the proof, and now it's time for the truth to be recognized. The inheritance is mine. Not because I fought, not because I schemed, but because grandfather intended it for me. And anyone who tried to take it by deception is accountable." For the first time, my brother looked genuinely afraid. The fiancé's arrogance crumbled, replaced by desperation. My parents were stunned, forced to confront their blind favoritism. The room felt like it had been vacuumed of its usual pretension. Nothing could mask the reality anymore. I leaned back, letting the gravity of the moment sink in. From now on, honesty is non-negotiable. Loyalty cannot come at the cost of truth, and anyone who refuses to accept that, well, the consequences speak for themselves. The confrontation left the family shaken. My brother and his fiancée retreated into silence, trying to calculate their next move. My parents avoided my gaze, realizing that their partiality had blinded them to the truth for too long. And I felt a mix of relief and determination. This wasn't the end. The fallout would continue, but I had struck the first decisive blow. For the first time in my life, I wasn't in the shadow of my golden boy brother. I had taken control, not with anger, not with impulsive rage, but with precision, patience, and undeniable truth. And the family I once knew would never be the same. The morning after the confrontation, the house felt different. The air was heavier, charged with tension and unspoken truths. I woke to an eerie silence, the kind that signals the calm after a storm, but also the uncertainty of what comes next. My brother didn't speak to me. His fiancée barely made eye contact. My parents, who had once been so comfortable in their favoritism, now avoided the room I was in, as if my presence itself reminded them of their failure. And for the first time, I felt a quiet sense of vindication. The fallout began almost immediately. Family, friends, and distant relatives who had been oblivious to the family drama started noticing the shift. Whispered conversations, cautious glances at gatherings, subtle questions about finances. It was as if the truth had rippled through every layer of our social circle. My brother, of course, reacted predictably. He tried to reclaim his arrogance, forcing smiles and making empty jokes, but the charm that had always shielded him failed. He attempted to rally support from some relatives, claiming I had overstepped and misrepresented the situation. But the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings, the letters, the documents, nothing could be denied or twisted. His fiancée fared even worse. The veneer of confidence she had worn for months crumbled completely. She attempted to play the victim, suggesting she was being so unfairly targeted, but even my parents could see through it. Her manipulations, which had seemed subtle before, were now glaringly obvious to everyone. As for my parents, the fallout was the hardest on them. They were forced to confront years of favoritism and denial. My father, once so sure of his judgment, spent hours reviewing the documents I had laid out, realization dawning with every page. My mother, whose affection for my brother had always blinded her to fairness, wept quietly, finally acknowledging that she had allowed injustice to thrive under her watch. The inheritance itself became a battleground, though it was no longer mine to fight for. It was mine by right. Legal confirmations, witnesses, and the documents I had gathered ensured that my brother and his fiancée had no claim. Their attempts to manipulate the situation collapsed entirely, leaving them both humiliated and powerless. Beyond finances, the family itself began to fracture. Arguments erupted between relatives who had blindly supported my brother and those who recognized the truth. Social alliances shifted, long-held assumptions were challenged, and the veneer of unity my parents had cultivated for years cracked irreparably. I found myself in a strange position, one of control, yes, but also one of observation. I could watch as the people who had tried to manipulate me struggled with the consequences of their actions. My brother's arrogance was replaced by quiet calculation, his fiancée's confidence by fear and resentment. And my parents? They were left to grapple with guilt, shame, and the knowledge that they had misjudged me for years. Amid all this chaos, I remained calm. I didn't gloat, I didn't mock. My goal had never been revenge for its own sake. It had been justice, truth, and recognition. And now, I finally had it. Friends and distant relatives who had once ignored me began to approach with quiet congratulations, offering support and acknowledgement I had long been denied. For the first time, I felt that my place in the family and in the world was secure. Not because of favoritism, but because of integrity and careful strategy. The house itself felt different. Where it had once been a place of constant comparison and subtle undermining, it now seemed quieter, more tense, but also more honest. Conversations were deliberate, words measured, and every interaction carried the weight of the truth we could no longer ignore. And yet, even in the aftermath, I knew this was not the end. Relationships would continue to shift. Some bonds, once thought permanent, had been broken beyond repair. Others would be tested as my parents struggled to reconcile their past actions with the reality they now faced. But for me, there was a sense of closure. I had protected what was mine, exposed the lies and manipulations that had shadowed my life, and forced my family to face the consequences of their choices. I had stepped out of my brother's shadow, claimed my inheritance, and, most importantly, reclaimed my own voice. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged. not because someone else deemed me worthy, but because I had fought for and secured my own place. And as I looked around the room, observing the subdued expressions of my brother, his fiancée, and my parents, I knew one thing with certainty. The family had been irrevocably changed. Some would resent me, some would try to rebuild trust, and some would retreat entirely. But I had done what I needed to do. And in that moment, the sense of relief was profound, almost overwhelming. The storm had passed, and for the first time, I could see clearly. My inheritance was safe, my family's secrets were exposed, and I was finally free to chart my own path, on my own terms. The weeks following the fallout were strange, almost surreal. The tension in the house had not vanished. It had transformed. Conversations were shorter, words weighed with caution, and every glance seemed to carry the memory of the confrontation. My brother no longer moved with effortless confidence. His fiancée no longer radiated arrogance. Even my parents, once so sure in their favoritism, now hesitated not before speaking, the weight of truth pressing down on them. For me, the sense of victory was tempered with reflection. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclamation. I had exposed the manipulation, safeguarded my inheritance, and ensured that the family could no longer treat me as invisible or powerless. But I also knew that relationships, once fractured, might never be fully repaired, and that was okay. My brother withdrew socially. He avoided eye contact, no longer trying to charm relatives or assert control over family gatherings. His fiancée retreated with him, her previous confidence replaced by a thin veneer of composure. Together, they had lost the illusion of control, and it showed in every interaction. My parents were quieter than ever. They apologized in private, awkward, strained apologies that I accepted with calm dignity. I didn't need them to recognize the full depth of my feelings. It was enough that they acknowledged the truth. Their support had shifted from blind loyalty to cautious observation, and I welcomed that change. In practical terms, the inheritance was secure. The documents, the recordings, and the witnesses I had gathered ensured that no one could challenge it successfully. I was free to use the resources my grandfather intended for me, not for the whims of a golden boy or his scheming fiancé. But the real change was emotional. I had grown stronger, not because I had fought my family, but because I had claimed my own voice. I no longer felt the shadow of my brother looming over me. The quiet resentment, the frustration of being overlooked had been replaced with confidence and clarity. I could finally plan my life on my terms. Family gatherings were tense at first. I noticed subtle attempts at reconciliation from some relatives, while others simply distanced themselves. My brother and his fiancée, once so entwined in their schemes, now seemed like strangers. The facade of unity my parents had tried to maintain had been replaced by honest, if uncomfortable, reality. And then slowly, life returned to a new normal. I invested in ventures my grandfather had left in trust, started projects I had long dreamed of, and even began reconnecting with distant relatives who respected integrity over manipulation. The house, once a place of suffocating favoritism, became a neutral ground, a space where honesty, rather than pretense, defined interactions. Occasionally, my brother would attempt a conversation, carefully measured, trying to gauge if reconciliation was possible. I responded politely, firmly, and without anger. I had no desire to humiliate him further. My goal was simply to assert my rightful place. His fiancée tried the same, but the lessons were clear. The days of entitlement were over. I also realized something important. Exposing the family secret hadn't just protected my inheritance. It had reshaped the dynamics of the entire family. Some bonds were irreparably broken, but others were strengthened by clarity and honesty. Trust, once shattered, was being rebuilt cautiously, but on a foundation of truth rather than favoritism. One quiet evening, sitting in my study, surrounded by the documents that had once been a source of power and now represented security, I reflected on the journey. Anger, frustration, and resentment had fueled the early days, but patience, strategy, and attention to detail had achieved lasting results. I had taken control not through chaos, but through precision. And most importantly, I had finally stepped out of my brother's shadow. The golden boy narrative no longer applied to me. I had earned recognition, secured my legacy, and more than that, proven to myself that power could be reclaimed with intellect and resolve rather than brute force or manipulation. As I looked around the room, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known for years. The family was fractured, yes, but the fractures were honest, grounded in truth, not lies. My inheritance was safe. My voice had been heard, and I had finally carved my own place in a family that had once overlooked me. For the first time, I could breathe freely. The past had been confronted, the present secured, and the future, my future, was mine to shape. And for the first time in my life, I felt genuinely, unequivocally free.